Welcome to the discussion. Today my guests are Bo Hauser, the Chief Information Security Officer at the Small Business Administration, Howard White, the Chief Information Officer at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Amir Dastori, the Identity Services Branch Manager at the Homeland Security Department, and Sean Frazier, the Advisory Chief Information Security Officer for Federal at Duo Security. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Before we get started, let me set some context. Federal cybersecurity is in the middle of a convergence. It's not about defense in depth, it's not about perimeter security, and it's not about identity and access management. In fact, federal cybersecurity is converging around all of these concepts and much more. The latest FISMA report to Congress shows why this convergence is happening. Agencies faced more than 31,000 cyber attacks in 2018, with a strong majority coming from email and phishing. And for the first time, agencies also faced impersonation or spoofing attacks, once again proving the ever-changing nature of how bad actors are trying to steal data and inflict pain on the federal government. At the same time, cybersecurity is converging around IT modernization with Cloud Smart, data center consolidation, and other directives from OMB that are pushing agencies to move away from legacy systems and onto modern and secure platforms. So as agencies move toward this hybrid cloud environment, managing, verifying, authenticating your employee's identity becomes even more critical. That's why concepts like zero trust are gaining steam in government. Earlier this year, the CIO Council and OMB said it's working with the National Institute of Standards and Technology to assess current state of technology that fits under the zero trust framework. OMB also is exploring other areas that may feed into policy updates to address zero trust concepts. And of course, a lot of agencies are looking into zero trust. DHS is doing something called trust zones, ensuring that there's a clear boundary around the system and how the architecture and the business owners who control the network and the system. So with all that going on, how do we make the right balance? Security, improve security, get to IT modernization, and of course, deal with the concept of zero trust. So with that context in place, let's turn to our panelists. Amir, let's start with you. You have identity in your name. Identity management is a big issue. We're seeing kind of a resurgence of it over the last 6 or 8 months. Talk a little bit about DHS's identity management strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate you having me on the show. So our identity access management strategy at DHS all starts with strong governance. We have a couple executive steering committees, CIO, CSO chair one of our executive steering committees, and all of our management CXOs chair another, which really puts identity access management into kind of the business frame. Like what can identity access management do to enable our users while increasing our cybersecurity? From there, a big focus of what we're doing right now is on data-driven decisions. We're looking at all of our information repositories that have identity data, taking that and improving the data quality. Where does the data live? How can we use it? Is it usable? How do we improve its quality so we can really make decisions off of that identity data? From there, we've taken that data and also focused on kind of the governance of our identity as a whole. How do we improve our onboarding and offboarding processes to really know who's here, where are they, what are they doing, and when do they leave? And to me, that really sets both the foundation as well as the tone for the rest of identity. So if we want to authenticate someone, if we want to authorize someone, well, we have a good grasp about who they are when they came here and the data about them, which then enables us to go into those authentication and authorization scenarios. And we're moving it from an authentication perspective from just passwords to strong authentication to now more risk-based and context-aware. It's not enough that they have a PIV card or they came from a given location, but what are they doing? What type of data are they trying to access? So we can kind of build our identity strategy around that.
All right, there's a ton there to unpack. Let me just go with the one piece is getting off of passwords, more of a risk-based decision. Can you kind of give us a little bit more about what that maybe will look like or does look like?
Sure. So right now, again, we've focused a lot on first PIV for the network, and then it was a remote access, and then now application landscape. So what we've done is really try to understand and make it simple for users by enabling things like single sign-on. But from there, we need to make sure we know what the user authenticated with. Did they authenticate with a PIV today? Did they authenticate with an alternate credential? What system are they actually accessing and what data are they trying to access? And all those play a part into making those decisions of should I let them in or not?
Howard, let's start with FDIC. You guys obviously aren't as big as Homeland Security, but you protect some of the most important data around financial management, financial systems. Talk a little bit about your identity management strategy.
So our strategy is always evolving. It's based on a focus on the mission of what do we want to accomplish, what do our users need in their day-to-day operations, and always changing our strategy based on the needs of the organization. We do use the PIV card, but we also look at alternate capabilities to meet the users in the field. We're looking at things like certificate management to gain access to the network, or segmenting the data as folks speak about. We consider ourselves to be very risk-based in everything that we do. So we look at who's accessing the data, just as Mira said, but how are they being authorized to access that data? Are they transferring that data across systems that's not authorized, and being able to make a decision and identify the security folks or their managers to let them be aware of things that are happening across the network.
One of the things about making those risk-based decisions, and we're seeing a little bit of a trend here, is knowing the roles and responsibilities. Is that something, again, going back to maybe something Amir said, is the governance piece, is that where you're spending a lot of your time, or have you spent a lot of your time to say Howard White is allowed to see this type of data, or Howard White is allowed to change this type of data?
So we do have roles that are defined by the business. Those are modeled in our systems, and those are associated with the data that they're authorized to use. But we also track the systems from which they can access those data points and can turn on or turn off those capabilities based on risk across the enterprise.
I think that's really the key. I mean, it's identity, but it's also the key to cybersecurity. Is Howard White usually logs in from Washington D.C. Monday through Friday. Well, probably Saturday and Sunday too, to a certain extent. But all of a sudden you're logging in from China. That's probably a flag.
Correct. So one of the things that I want to do is also push that down to the user to let them know where they logged in from. What device did we last see them log in from, so that they become part of the solution set to protect the environment, that it's not just dependent on someone in the security operations center or someone on the operations floor trying to model the user's behavior. But we model it, show it to them, and they help us make a decision around, was that me or was that someone else impersonating me on the network?
Or even if they're, hey, I'm going to be traveling, by the way, I'll be logging in from unusual places. I think that's another key piece. That's why they have to be part of it, the user.
Correct.
Sean, let's talk about duo security. When you guys talk to your customers and identity management comes up, what are some of the trends? What are some of the things you hear?
So I think, much like Howard was saying, we see customers moving to a more risk-based approach, moving away from kind of monolithic security technology. We see people kind of adopting zero trust, and zero trust has been around for a long time, and it's only really caught on just because of the things that are being forced upon us now, which are mobility, cloud, and now soon to be 5G. So if you think about data centers and applications I don't necessarily own, and users and endpoints I don't necessarily control or manage, and then you've also got networks I don't necessarily own. Really, the inevitable security model for that is something where you really can only work with what you can control, which is your user access to that data. And it is a very risk-based approach function, where you're not just going to trust somebody by virtue of the fact that they've gotten on the network. So we used to talk about this thing called comply to connect. Comply to connect is dead. We're now doing comply to access or comply to auth. And what that is really saying is that's saying that I don't necessarily trust you just because of what network you're on. Because for my life, I live in Starbucks and on Southwest flights. And for me, that's where I do a lot of my compute. A lot of people are more traveling. So if you look at kind of the culture shift that's happening as well, younger workers coming in, users expecting to use iPhones and touch technology and being able to do fluid work wherever they are, that's forcing this conversation.
It's funny you mentioned comply to connect is dead. We just actually are working on something around a story that has, I think it's the Marines, but maybe someone else in DoD has just transferred a big chunk of money for comply to connect. But hopefully they're just using the old terminology.
Yeah.
And
it's old terminology for the new technology.
Exactly,
yeah.
comply to access. One of the things that when you talk about the accessing of the identity plays the key role, is that the difference between maybe the discussion that you had with your customers 6 years ago, 5 years ago, where it was like, well, how do we protect the application? How do we protect the system? Now they're saying, how do we protect the data through identity?
Yeah, absolutely, and kind of tying that identity to the access, and Howard and Amir talked brilliantly about what their organizations are doing for this. Making sure that the person who's accessing that stuff has the valid right to do that, and making sure you're authenticating and authorizing that user continuously. So you're not just doing one and done. You're making sure every time that user comes in and requests access to that information, you're validating some core things. You're validating they are who they say they are, and you're doing that with multi-factor authentication, whether that be a smart card or a PIV-D, or whether that be a Duo technology or something like us. And you're also making sure that all the constructs around that are valid. So things like you talked about user behavior. So if I log into something and I'm not in my normal zone that I'm usually in, 99% of the time, does that change behavior? Does that change the calculus for do I allow that access or not?
Bo, let's bring you into the conversation around SBA. Again, much different than the other folks, your other colleagues from government, because you guys deal with so many, if you will, your citizen services, and you need to deal with identity access management for those citizen services, but then you also hold some very sensitive data around loans, around contracting. How are you finding that balance?
So we started an aggressive modernization initiative a few years back, and we've been on this path pretty heavily, really leaning into the cloud as much as possible. And it caused us to relook at identity and access management in that context. And so we identified a lot of areas across the environment where we're placing extra burdens on our customers. If they go through this door, they need this authentication. If they go through a different door, they need a different one. So we're on a path now to try to consolidate those identities into one, using services like login.gov to do that, to make it easier on our customers, strengthen the authentication, and simplifying it for them. Internally, we've done a lot around improving the same thing. We leverage the PIV card as far as we can internally because that identity is built into it. And we've actually segmented the use of the PIV based on the role. And so if you are a privileged user, we have various tiers of privilege that you fall into. So if you're primarily focused on endpoints, you have admin access on the endpoint, and then we limit that. And then same thing with the server role. If you're a server admin, we have an island model for that. And then there's only a few folks who have that keys to the kingdom model there. So we've done a lot to modernize. And the other element of that is cloud. When you're accessing the cloud, it's super, super flexible. You get to the cloud edge from anywhere. And with Zero Trust and these other capabilities, we have much more control at the cloud edge to do some of the checks beyond just username and password or just strong auth. We can do things based on where you're coming from and which device you're on to sort of start getting into that Zero Trust way of thinking. So, and then, to your point earlier about a foreign login where that's an anomaly, the AI in the cloud makes that simple. And we're using those kind of tools as well.
One of the things you brought up is you brought us kind of full circle about the topic, right? Identity plus IT modernization. The question I guess comes to mind is, are we talking about the chicken or the egg, right? Do you deal with identity and then you modernize? And I know the answer is the same time. You can't do one instead of the other. But maybe just to open up to the panel, but maybe both start. How did you think about identity management as you were modernizing? Because there's definitely some challenges that come with, okay, how do we restrict as we bring in these new technologies?
So the HSPD 12, some viewed that as a very rigid direction, and so it limited some of our ability to embrace these new technologies. And so I was grateful that OMB released a new policy lately that kind of created some space there for us to experiment. And I think that's key. As we go forward, we have to take advantage of these different technologies to get where we want to get to. So, get out of those limitations that had been perceived.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think that we've had policy guidance that was kind of locked into technology, and that's a problem, because what that's done with technology adoption has only accelerated at the rate of change. So the recent guidance, so it started with kind of 63.3 from NIST around identity, and then the OMB 1917 guidance around identity has really opened up and allowed for flexibility based upon risk. So not saying get rid of the PIV, not saying get rid of the CAC, there are plenty of those around. We spend a lot of resources managing those, but if you can't use those, you can't just use a password. You have to do something better than that. So here are some options for that, some risk-based options that kind of allow agencies to head down that path.
Howard?
Yeah, so I agree that you can't do them without the other, and it's key that you look at the new policies, but also get back to 839, which is risk-based, and it leaves you up to your risk manager and the folks that are responsible for the agency to say, how do I need to accomplish my mission? And utilizing the capabilities that are available to us to execute on the mission. And that's always the key. And always being able to continuously monitor what is going on in the environment, and when something is abnormal, getting it in front of the right folks so that the information can be used, not for knowledge, but for action. so that you can take immediate action to protect the environment.
So both FDIC and SBA are kind of maybe a little bit out in front when we're talking about CDM, and I know that could take us down a whole different path, but is those capabilities from CDM where you're able to have a dashboard and know what's on your network, did that lead you down to this, okay, now we can kind of do what Howard was saying, was make those risk decisions because we're getting that data in? I mean, the building blocks have been coming, I guess is maybe the better word.
So we're not as far with CDM as we should be because we were part of the smaller agencies.
Oh, okay.
But we built our own dashboards internally to the organization based on needs from the CIO, the CISO, operations, and also the executives, is to tell them what's going on the network. So the CDM framework is great, and we took a lot of the things that they were developing and potentially enhanced it for our own mission needs. And when we do get involved with CDM fully, we'll replicate the data and then potentially collapse them. But that is a great framework, the continuous monitoring framework,
right,
that is there, that we have the input into to say improvements are needed, because DHS may not know the exact mission of some of the organization. So we are engaged with them.
Okay, Bo?
I think the path of CDM offers some of that. I think where we are right now has been primarily around cyber hygiene and really caring for your environment the way that we all need to. But I think where we're going is having much more flexibility beyond what's on our network. So like under a zero trust model, we have the option now to accept, for example, a personal device connecting to our environment and being able to very surgically restrict the actions that occur over that untrusted connection. Whereas before it was sort of, you log in and you're in, and you're restricted by the role that you have, and now we're able to have much more flexibility at those, to make those risk decisions. So it gives us many more tools in our toolbox, is how I view it.
All right, we're gonna take a quick break. When we come back, there's plenty more to talk about. You're listening to the panel discussion, Exploring Cybersecurity's Weakest Link, Identity Management, sponsored by Duo Security on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.